Hello, everyone. Today, I want to cover one of the most transformative social movements of the 1960s, and this is the rise of the New Left, right? So, a lot of people envision this New Left as being, only hippies or an anti-war movement, but the reality is that it's way more deeper than that. There is a lot of activism, there is a lot of legislation, there is a very significant Supreme Court decision coming out of all this, and all of these things have transformed modern politics and we can still see some of those repercussions today. All right, so let's get started. So to understand this new left, I think it is first very important to understand the old left. And for me, the best way to explain the old left is to call it a Marxist left, all right? Because it concentrated a lot on class struggles, right? On workers' rights, labor unions, but it kind of sort of didn't concentrate too much on social issues, on gender inequalities or, racial problems. So this new left rises kind of sort of as a challenge, as a criticism of this old left that they felt left a lot of people marginalized. That this old left concentrated a lot on white, suburban, middle to lower class Americans, right? So they emerged from the criticism of the Vietnam War, from this anti-war movement, and they kind of sort of continue to broaden the spectrum and consider that we should also not forget about some deeper problems that are in America at the time, right? Like not just class struggles between rich and poor or the worker class, right? But also racial issues. So this new left not only challenged the right, but also challenged the old left, right? Because they felt like these two groups focused way too much on communism, that they focused too much on class struggles, rich and poor, but they felt like both of this group left some marginalized group without a voice, like African Americans or women who maybe don't want to follow the traditional gender roles, or African Americans that they may feel like, civil rights movement may not be enough, but there's other systemic issues or poverty attached to their problems. And they felt like the right and the old left were inadequate and were not addressing all these deeper social issues while they kept concentrating too much on anti-communism and the war in Vietnam, right? So a lot of this, for example, you can see it in this debate for the presidential election between Kennedy and Nixon. If you look at that debate, Kennedy and Nixon are very similar. I consider them to be both formidable candidates, and a lot of their policies are very similar, right? I don't think you could have gone right or wrong in choosing Nixon or Kennedy because these guys are very similar, but they didn't focus a lot on the social issues that the new left sought to address. All right. So this is where you see the rise of this new left and this growth in this counterculture movement. And so this new left emerges as a counterculture to the acceptable mainstream, right? So basically, this counterculture is all about challenging, the norms, the values, the expectations of society, right? So you see it a lot being embodied by the hippies, right? Long hair, not owning possessions, living in communes, a lot of drugs, a lot of sex, because the acceptable traditions of the time was, for example, a nuclear family, right? A family with a husband, with a wife, a husband provider, a wife that is a mother, children, that are, expected to go to school. But, things like abortion were seen as taboo, divorce was seen as taboo, women were not expected to go to work or to have an education. And this seemed to be the expectations for everyone in society. And so this counterculture movement, this new left emerges to challenge all these narratives, right? So the hippies kind of sort of embody all that. But from all this idea of the new left, we're going to see all these different movements, all right? So I think it is important to understand that this idea of the new left, it is not a single unified movement, but rather a combination of a lot of different activist groups that seek to challenge the established norms. So, for example, we're going to see second wave feminism. You're also going to see the Black Panther Party. You're going to see the Chicano movement. You're also going to see the Gay Liberation Front. And if you pay attention, these groups are more interested in social equality, right? Racial and gender equality, right? They're not so much concentrated on economic rights, but rather social problems that they basically believe neither the old right or the old left were addressing these issues. And they believe that by focusing primarily in these groups, this is going to be the only way that they can get, you know, a more equitable society for these groups. And so the goals of the new left can be articulated in something called the Port Huron Statement, right? So the Port Huron Statement is basically a manifesto by the Students for a Democratic Society, right? So here's where they outline or delineate, how should this new movement address these different problems, right? And for example, we're gonna concentrate on three big problems that they seek to address in this manifesto, right? So the first one is the anti-war movement, right? So they basically see the war in Vietnam as everything that is wrong with the United States, right? The government lying to the people, focusing on problems abroad as opposed to the problems, at home. They see as the US taking advantage of a smaller nation, being, kind of like a bully to all these different nations. And this is a huge criticism to the left and the right in concentrating way too much on anti-communism as opposed to the problems at home, all right? Number two is what they call participatory democracy, right? So participatory democracy, I believe, is very interesting, right? Because it basically criticizes people who only care about politics every 4 years. So this is something that I personally very much agree with, right? Because what they see is that if you want to see change, the change should be achieved daily, right? By participating in universities, by participating in your local government, state governments, by being involved in politics. Okay, so it's getting all these younger people from this new generation to participate a lot in government, right? To your local, to your state, to your federal, and not just in the national government every 4 years. And it is going to bring this new generation of you know citizens who are very involved in politics, and they're going to be very active in trying to enact change. So this is what they call participatory democracy. In other words, the anti-war movement through the war of Vietnam, through all this criticism of the war in Vietnam, you know understanding that the government has lied to us, and the only way that we can achieve real change is through participatory democracy. And I think the best statistic for me to explain to you is that before the war in Vietnam, by the 1960s, about 90% of the people trusted in the government to do what is best for their interests, right? By the end of the war in Vietnam, about only 25% of the people believed that the government was there for their best interest, right? So, this tells you a lot, not only about the downfalls of the war in Vietnam, but how significant this idea of participatory democracy was, right? The government won't do what is best in your interest. Maybe they don't have the best incentives, so it is up to you to enact this change. And the last one is moral responsibility, basically saying that being detached and not being participating in all these different issues is the major obstacles to getting these real changes, right? So is making people morally responsible for the problems that are happening here in the US, right? So don't be detached, be participating on it, be involved, and this is the best way to achieve change. And so during this time, during the 1960s and early 1970s, is when you're going to see the rise of this new left, right? Because it resonated a lot with a very young generation who are trying to do some change, right? And this is kind of like the very active participation of change, right? So a lot of people are going to join in the movement, be it through, second wave feminism or the Black Panther Party, Chicano movement, Gay Liberation Front, whatever it is. A lot of people joined this movement. Some of them became hippies, some of them joined anti-war protests. But the idea is that these people sought to bring change, right? And especially what you see in this Port Huron statement, I always feel that it resonates a lot, right? Because is giving people the moral responsibility and putting it in your hands to bring change rather than let the government bring the change, right? And particularly for our modern times, I think it is very significant to think about these issues, right? In times where you put all your trust in the government or you blindly trust the government, this ideas of participatory democracy, of moral responsibility still sound, very relevant to today. So especially in the 60s, people felt very drawn to these things, all right? So there are two examples that to me highlight, the tremendous impact of the rise of the New Left and the activism of the time, all right? And one of them is the March on the Pentagon. So in 1967, around 50,000 people marched from the Lincoln Memorial to the Pentagon to do a peaceful protest, a demonstration to show a lot of youth people from the United States in this anti-war movement. So there's a lot of very iconic images from this. The most famous is the one of the young people putting flowers on the barrels of the guns of the military. And it just showed how this new left, was increasingly becoming more and more powerful. And, this idea of civil disobedience and this, iconic images, resonated a lot with a very young generation. But to me, what highlights the most of the power, the activism of the new left, and more than anything, the second wave feminism, is the idea of Roe v. Wade, right? Roe v. Wade is this tremendous landmark decision that is going to give access to abortion nationwide, right? So the reason I mentioned this is so significant and it highlights the tremendous impact of the social activism is because without a second wave feminism, the Supreme Court more than likely would not have ruled in the way that it did. All right. So the Supreme Court basically felt compelled to rule in that direction because they felt like that is what the people wanted at the time, right? But constitutionally, the Supreme Court was not supposed to rule in this direction. However, judicial activism is what made the difference here, right? Basically, the judges felt compelled to be activists and to give the people what they felt they wanted, right? So rather than judge in a constitutional manner, they rather judge in a way which basically reflects what do the people want, right? So if you're able to influence the Supreme Court to judge in your direction, your movement is tremendously powerful. Because in the 1960s and early 70s, second wave feminism was extremely big, it was extremely impactful. And again, to me, what highlights it the most is the fact that they even influenced the Supreme Court decision to rule in their direction. And so, just like we saw the rise of the new left, we're also going to see the fall of the new left. And one way to understand the fall of the new left is to remember something that I mentioned earlier. This is not a single unified movement, but is rather a fragmentation of different, activist groups, right? So, for example, second wave feminism, anti-war movement, the Gay Liberation Front, Chicano movement, they're all not unified. Sometimes some people support one but not the other, and they're all part of the same movement that want change, but that they're not necessarily the same group of people fighting for the same things. And over time, a lot of people want to go back a little bit to law and order. Some people want a little bit of stability. And, this group, after about a decade of upheaval, about a decade of a lot of change, very radical change for the time, a lot of, the hippie movement and a lot of, sex, drugs, all these different things that people consider radical at the time. People wanted to go back a little bit to the stability. And what highlighted a lot of this is Richard Nixon's silent majority speech, right? So in 1969, Richard Nixon gives this very famous speech in which he basically delineates the idea that the majority of the people in America were not fond of the new left. They didn't want to join the hippie movement. They were not very happy with the idea of, a lot of sex, a lot of drugs, a lot of this free spirit, a lot of this protests and marches, and most people were looking to get back to law and order. A lot of people still loved American, were not anti-war protesters, and he called this the silent majority. And the argument of Richard Nixon was basically that the majority of the people did not want to join these things and were basically silent, but they're wanting to go back to law and order already. The argument is that this group of people who participate in the New Left are loud, but they're a minority, right? So he basically outlines more or less the idea of we want to go back to law and order. And, with the election of Nixon and then the eventual, presidency of Jimmy Carter, the failure of the presidency of, of Jimmy Carter, we're also going to see a rise of a new right. And on the tails of this new right, we're going to see the presidency of Ronald Reagan, who's going to embody all this new right, right? So the way I see it, just like there's just like there was a new left, there was also a new right, right? It was like this pendulum swinging. The new left was activism, change, challenging social norms and everything that we just talked about. But when society felt the pendulum went too much to one side, we saw the collapse of the new left and then we saw the rise of the new right. And this new right is going to be basically the opposite of the new left. Is going to be a lot of religion, a lot of law and order, a lot of family values, and it's basically going to be the opposite of all that, going back to the old traditional norms, and it's all going to be embodied mostly by Ronald Reagan. And there's other things, not just that. You're gonna see the Reaganomics. You're gonna see the cut of social welfare. You're gonna see more fight against the Soviet Union. So it's a whole different lecture. It's a whole different topic. But anyways, let me know what you think. If it all sounds familiar, it's because in this past years, this past decades, we've been undergoing the same process, right? Pendulum going a little bit to the left, and in recent years, probably with this very recent presidential election, the pendulum is going now a little bit to the right. And when people say that history repeats itself, this is exactly what they mean. And just another reason why I believe these conversations are still very relevant today, because you can learn a lot from it, right? These are things that happened, in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 60s. So these are extremely recent and they're still very relevant today. For example, the new left is what shaped the current Democratic Party, and eventually what we're gonna see with the new right is what shaped the very recent Republican Party, right? So these topics are still very relevant, and it's one way to understand the American politics of today, right? So this is all I have for today. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you guys around. Okay, see y'all.